Good afternoon, MMS. So you guys honestly thought, you know what, we could go somewhere and get some lunch, or we can go hear about some app compat. And you thought that the app compat sounded like the better idea. Well done. I am happy to report, kind of wandering back through the rows, and you can feel free to try this on your own if you want to wander around. You probably won't disturb too many people. In this room, there is more Windows 8 than Windows XP. True story. Come on, give yourself a round of applause. That was not true last year. There was not more anything else than Windows XP in this room last year. So that's some really fantastic progress. We're here today to talk about how do we get unstuck from where we are, basically as a planet. You know, the lost decade, the decade when we could all stay on the exact same stuff and still stay relatively modern. How do we get out from underneath that? And then talk about generally how to become more agile and what are people doing. How many of you are here because you got some part of your stack that you'd like to finish getting rid of, whether it be old Windows XP or old IE or old Office? Yeah, so most of you here, like, there's something that's a little bit sticky and gunky and sticking on there. So we're going to talk about a lot of those tips and what we're finding really helps. And as a special bonus, we're going to be doing some math here today. You're welcome. So I want to talk first about one of the key things that helps people get there is to have the people who are driving that process be actually motivated to get there. So what I'll do is show a quick video of one of the reasons why people like the latest version of Windows that perhaps you didn't think of.
Hi, my name is Alvy. I like debugging programs. One day during my homework, I thought, what if I had an operating system that stored the handle to a debug object in the thread environment block to provide native support for debugging. So I invented Windows 7. It was the debug. Uh-oh, this program is broken. Oh, it's still user mode. That's baby stuff. Really? See? Easy. Windows 7 was my idea, so give me $100 million.
So she's a little young, she's a little slow on the keyboard, apologies for that. But it's interesting that that actually is one of the main reasons why people go faster is if they actually feel that there's something in it for them that they want. Right? And so when I think about what might be in it for this audience, the first thing that I thought about was manageability. Heck, look at the name of the conference. So when I think about manageability, one of the things that often comes to my mind is the other guys are kind of giving this one to us. Like, hey, you know, if you're finding it hard to deploy a new web browser once every, I don't know, 12 years, do you think doing it 100 times as often is your solution? A better life cycle. We think about the group policies that we have, because more is better, right? Well, that's true in the case of Ferraris. The more Ferraris you have, the better off you are. But when we talk about our group policies, the sense of, hey, look at how many we have. That's our management story. We have over 1,500 of them now, which gives us this number of different possible permutations of the group policies in IE. By way of comparison, this is the number of molecules in the observable universe. So there is also something to be said for sticking with well-known and proven solution. So the fact that you can manage it, fantastic. You can implement scenarios. Doesn't mean you should go one by one through each and every single one of them and end up with one of these rather large number of different permutations that no one on the planet has ever seen before. This is actually one of the more interesting AppCompat conundrums that we have right now is when the site works on vanilla IE but doesn't work once I get it to my particular set of group policies, and how do we address that? But it's always good to be thinking about why is it that your team wants to get there? Why is it that target audiences who are getting there want to get there? What audience are you talking to? So, one of the tips that I've gotten from folks is to make sure if you are trying to market your product to developers, say, find some reason why they would want it. A lot of developers have no idea that Internet Explorer now has as many tools to help developers as the other guy. I'm thinking Firebug here, right? And some of the things that we have now, right? So we'll look at this particular website. This is just google.com. And if I'm a developer and I look at debugging something, it turns out that's not so fun to debug. It's great when you're paying the bandwidth bill, not so great if you are responsible for doing the troubleshooting on it. But we have a neat little feature called Format JavaScript, which neatly groups this into functions. I've showed that to developers and have them go, whoa, that's pretty cool. This concept of what is it that people want and helping to make sure that it seems relevant to them and it seems desirable to them is the number one indicator for how successful you can be at motivating people. So that's what we want to talk about today is how do we take the whole concept of moving forward to the latest platform, whatever it is, whether it be IE or Windows or Office, and make that something that's not quite as painful as the one that it is today. And I want to talk about some of the practices that we have in place today that may not be working, the approach that makes it so that the average update, whether it be on the Office side or on the IE side or the Windows side, is between 12 and 18 months. And it seems to be getting longer. And we keep following the exact same procedures we always did. So there's one thing I like to keep in mind is the law of holes. Once you realize you are in a hole, it's time to stop digging. And we instead want to think about what is it that we're trying to achieve here. Because the fundamental problem comes down to we believe we can ever achieve perfection. And it's that pursuit of perfection that's a problem. Think about the process that most people use to migrate, say, from Windows XP to Windows 7. What's step one? Find all of your stuff, right? Step two, go through and cross a bunch of that stuff off. And then step three is go through and test it all, make sure it works, get it all certified, and then you can deploy. This sense that everything is knowable. And it makes sense that we would do this because we're trained like this. Ever since elementary school, we're trained to believe there's a right or a wrong answer. We're trained to believe that something can be compatible or can be incompatible with a particular operating system, a particular web browser, a particular version of Office. We are, in fact, so well trained in this that we believe it's possible for someone to write down a handful of things that emphatically determines how we can solve all of the problems in the world's economy. Please elect me. If we were going to actually tell the truth about what you're going to do if you wanted to fix the problems in the global economy, what would the truth really be? I have no idea what's going on. It's just way too complex. I can't figure out what's going on. So we're just going to try a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. Because it turns out the world is way too complex for certainty. We can't know, right? What does it mean to be compatible? To be compatible means I have no bugs on the platform I want that stop me from getting my work done. Those first two get us into a bit of a bind. Because Alan Turing proved in 1936 that we can never prove that there are no bugs in the platform you want. Can't be done. So we're only left with option 3 that stopped me from getting my work done. How do you prove whether or not you can get your work done? Try to do your work. Right? We have this massive, massive complexity that we've left IT organizations in charge of. And I think unfairly, and we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of the unfairness and how that works a little bit later. But when we think about the applications that run an enterprise, they're incredibly complex. How can a centralized IT organization know all about them? Most of the time, you don't even know that they're there. And it turns out that that is a very good thing in a lot of regards. So there's some research that's been done by a researcher who's at MIT named Cesar Hidalgo that talks about the network effect. And the complexity and the productivity of an organization is in direct relationship to how much you can store information needed to run that organization across the network, so that no one person can actually do everything, because it's simply too much. Think about the world's economy. This is showcasing some of the products and the relationships with each other. Think about a computer. How many of you could build a computer? And I don't mean build a computer with access to newegg.com. I mean build a computer with access to a pickaxe and a shovel and a fire. How many of you understand battery technology to assemble something to power that computer? How many of you could create a RAM chip on your own? You can't. That's stored in the network. Someone else can make this component. Someone else can make that component. And fortunately, the network is smart enough to know how to put it all together. The network is where the information is stored. We can't know everything about it. And that lets us do far more complicated things until we try to stuff all of that knowledge into ourselves. It's actually kind of one of the interesting engineering aspects to the way that we approach migrations off of XP and off of IE6 is that the engineers looked at the problem and they said, oh, well, the size and scope of the engineering problem for IE apps is much smaller than that for Windows apps. They're more complicated to troubleshoot and fix. So we spent much, much more time working on the Windows apps. The challenge with IE apps is that they were much more networked. What's an IE application built of? 3 building blocks at the very fundamental level. That's some HTML. Who knows that really, really well? Probably the tool you used to make it. I've got some CSS. Who knows that really well? The guy who designs the standard CSS for my company working on a Mac in another building that never comes to my meetings. And who knows the JavaScript? The developer who's actually writing the code. And no one person knows all 3 of those things. It's distributed across the network. The larger your company gets, the larger your network gets. And that's a good thing for the productivity of the organization. It's a bad thing when someone says, you got to know everything. So how do you deal with that complexity and break things down without taking on the burden of knowing everything there is to know about what has been stored in that network? Turns out we've invented a method back in the Enlightenment for helping to go through this. The scientific method that helps me break down problems and do things via trial and error. What's working, what's not working, and how can I build out an end-to-end story that actually helps me get to that endpoint. This is really hard because we are perfectionists. We want to know for sure. We want there to be no risk whatsoever. But it's not realistic for us to go through and assume that. Instead, we want to look at how do we measure the risk that we have and effectively manage it. That's hard for humans. Humans are great at taking stories and taking them to heart. Humans are terrible at statistics. Let's throw out one sort of interesting societal phenomenon, right? Back when I was a kid, so when, as my kids would say, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, my mom would just basically let me go outside and do whatever I wanted to do, starting at basically the time when I could walk. And now it seems we have to constantly pay for them to be doing some scheduled activity because the world outside is completely unsafe, and people are just being snatched about every 18 milliseconds on every block in every city of the world, right? Statistically speaking, are there fewer or more stranger abductions going on today? There are fewer of them. There are just more stories because, statistically speaking, are there fewer or more 24-hour news networks than there were in 1972? And the stories are what's sticky. So how do we leverage this concept of, okay, we've got stories that are sticky, but instead we want to move away from that and instead get to something that's much more sensible and risk-balanced? And the approach that we've seen people take that are much more successful is one that divides the task out and takes a risk-managed approach to moving to the new platform. The old way, find it all, rationalize it all, and then fix it all, and then go, doesn't work. But to instead take your stuff and divide it into a couple of bins. The bin of, you know what? No one gets the new one until we know this stuff works. Those are the applications that we're going to test proactively to make sure that they work in the business scenarios that matter to us before I deploy any pilot seats. So if I'm a consulting organization, right, that's where I work, what's important to us? We need to be able to bill customers. So our billing software turns out to be pretty important. Timekeeping software all revolves together. We can't upgrade until that stuff works. Right? If I were in pharma, right, all of the approval stuff to go through FDA approval, those have to actually be certified. So that's a different level of requirement there for folks who use those applications. They have to be validated. And all these different scenarios, I have things that I must proactively look at before anyone goes. But once I've looked at them, I can start pilot seats. I can start pushing people onto the new platform and let them find the things that are failing that aren't important enough for me to look at beforehand, to handle things reactively in exactly the same way that you're finding things today. You're already doing this unless you don't have a software help desk, because software fails. But if I take the approach of I'm going to look at everything exhaustively, you end up spending too much money because a lot of it will work. Again, you track the statistics. So let's say we look at the migration between IE8 and IE9. Right? So a lot of folks are kind of looking at that now. They finished there, right? And after you get to Windows 7, to IE8, what's the first thing you experience? Fatigue. I'm tired. I don't want to do that again for a while. Please give me a rest. But then after a while, you're like, all right, I think I'm rested up now, ready for a change. And let's take a look at here. The number of applications that have broken in a transition from IE8 to IE9 that you cannot fix using the built-in compatibility modes, that have led to an escalation that got me on the phone that I couldn't fix using one of the built-in compatibility modes, worldwide, since the day we shipped IE9, has been 4. So your risk is somewhat low taking that approach. So I wouldn't want to go through and proactively take everything and run it through the ringer because most of the things are going to pop out the other side working just fine. Instead, I want to find the ones where, you know what, if this one fails, I'm going to have to take a write-down of a couple $1 million. That's not cool. I can't do that. I'll take the time to test that one and let the rest get caught because most everything will come through just fine. A risk-balanced approach. And then the final step, which is one that we're just starting to really tell the story of now, is, all right, so I've looked at stuff proactively, and then I've caught a bunch of stuff reactively because I didn't find everything, because it turns out you actually do this even if you think you're doing it all proactively, because you missed some stuff. Have you ever just done testing in a lab and sat there and poked at it? Do you really find everything that's broken? Because it turns out that's kind of boring work. Where you really find it is when you're trying to do real stuff. The next phase is, okay, now I'm on this new platform. am I really using all of this new platform? Have I done anything to start getting some more benefits of this? Think about IE9. If I go to IE9 and I do absolutely nothing with HTML5, have I really done IE9? If I do Windows 8, right? There's a lot of conversations going on in this. If I go to Windows 8, but I don't have any Metro apps, and I'm just basically using it to get into the compatible desktop container, am I really getting everything out of Windows 8? What can I do to give me some fireworks to really take advantage of that new platform and gradually evolve, right? And this is one of the most important things I find from folks who are successful is they don't take a boil the ocean approach. They take an approach that says, we are going to do things opt-in one at a time, make something a little bit better, get it done, have a constrained time frame, and end up being much more successful that way. This three-phase approach, and even if you only do the first two, ends up being a lot more successful. Where you are and what industry you're in depends upon, determines to what extent you're willing to do this. It's interesting. I travel around the world working directly on site with customers, so I'm what they call a nerd. I'm not ashamed to admit that. And when I go and talk to customers, I notice some of the different patterns. It's fascinating to me that in Australia, this makes perfect sense. I go there, they're like, oh yeah, we're already doing that. We can't look at everything. That would be insane. I'm like, well then why haven't you finished yet? Because we haven't started the first one yet. Oh, okay, well let's get you started on that. In North America, and particularly in a few industries within North America, that's almost like, oh, I can't do that. I've made this statement at our, we have an executive briefing center, and I've made this statement, and I had someone from a large financial institution going, listen, I can't just let reactive support come on. If this application doesn't work, it's run on the trading room floor. It'll lose $10 million every minute. I said, well, that sounds like the kind of thing I'd put in the first bucket then. And they said, oh, okay, I guess it doesn't break the model. I had another one who said, I can't go to my business and say, we're not going to bother testing your stuff. They expect me to be on the hook to keep everything working all the time. I said, it sounds like you may not have a really great partnership with your business then. Because if they start looking at the dollars, most people tend to agree when we start thinking about those dollars. So when we look at the patterns and where we're getting through now, what comes up a lot of times is we just have a lot of legacy. Folks who are still on Windows XP, on IE6 or even IE7, or who are on Office 2003 are usually there because of a fairly healthy body of legacy applications. I was actually talking to someone outside before the session about their challenge in their industry. They're in healthcare, and the healthcare vertical is sort of a unique vertical in that there's a lot of applications that are highly sensitive to change because lives depend on them, so they don't go very fast. And there aren't as many massive players, right? So if I think, the mining industry, there are basically 3 major players in the mining industry. If one of them goes, that's a third of the industry. They can kind of push all of the vendors who make software for them to say, give me one that works in this environment. Healthcare is a lot more fragmented, so there's not one player who has more power. His challenge was one that I hadn't heard before. There he has a vendor making brand new 16-bit applications. The poor guy's in the room right now, and you just laughed at him, so I'll just point that out. It's not his fault. He didn't make them. But this is his challenge, is he needs to solve that business problem, and that's what they're still making. Why are they still making it? Because they haven't gotten the pressure, because they don't have the same kind of large market forces, right? Oligopolies do help push software industries forward. So you've got this challenge of legacy, and then when you take the legacy challenge and you contrast it with expectations, we need to make sure that we are correctly obeying the law. In this case, I'm going to use Plato's law. This is from Plato's Republic, this particular illustration. And from Plato's Republic comes the law of non-contradiction. You can't ask for something to be something and not be something at the same time. All right, and this is one example. I could go to Windows 7 with that software. I think it actually might even be supported. I just can't go to Windows 7 64-bit. So if my goal is to go to a pure 64-bit image but keep running this software, that's a contradiction. I can't do it. I had this conversation with a customer in Turkey. They were running software that didn't run as a non-admin. They wanted to go to Windows 7, and in doing so, they wanted to eliminate admin rights. Most people want to increase the number of non-admins they have in that transition. Why? Money. Right? The security guys are, oh, the purity of it, and blah, blah, blah. The purity doesn't matter to anyone. It's all about money. It costs 40% of the cost to manage a standard user desktop as it costs to manage an admin desktop. So why do they do it? To get more money back, to do more interesting things than re-image your machine after you break it for the 50th time. You guys are like, yeah, it's pretty much kind of what we want to do, is not keep re-imaging people's machines. It's getting kind of dull and boring. So that's where we're going. They wanted to do that, but they had an app that didn't work. And they said, well, make it work. So we took a look at it, and it turns out that there are a lot of things that you can do in Windows 7 to get an app that wants admin rights to work anyway. But there are some things they can try to do you can't work around, right? If you try to enable a privilege, say enable the SE debug privilege, if you don't have the privilege, it'll end in an error. If you don't handle the error correctly, it'll blow up your app. And there's nothing I can do to lie about having a privilege. I can lie about all kinds of things, just not that. So it's something we couldn't fix, and now they had a dilemma. Stop being a perfectionist and say, if you need to run this app, you'll have to run those users as non-admins until you get a new app. But you can't both have non-admins and demand to run software that won't run in that environment. The best policy is one that allows you to have compromise that says, do the best I can and keep moving forward. It's what the entire compatibility story at Microsoft is all about. Do your best to keep stuff working, but do your best to encourage people not to continue building on the old model. Take that thought over to IE, right? So this is about Windows and standard users. What about IE? IE has a very rich compatibility infrastructure, by which I mean we actually contain the entire rendering engine that we used to run from several different previous versions of our browser. In IE6, we had two of them. We had one that was compatible with your old IE5.5 apps. We called it Quirks mode. And you could opt into the new, highly standards compliant mode. And yes, in 2001, that didn't make people chuckle. Kind of does today, because it really sucks compared to what the stuff that's out there now. But at the time, it was good. It was so good that we were going to break everything. That's why we kept the old one there. We left the developers in charge of determining which of those two modes they ran in. Do you know how many developers I've ever talked to who knew what a doc type was and how it switched into standards or Quirks mode? One. Ever. So, all right, so we gave the responsibility to a bunch of folks who had no idea that they were bearing that responsibility. We went to IE7. We kept the existing Quirks mode since it was the default until the developer opted in, and we updated standards to be more standards compliant. Not too much more standards compliant, because we kind of hastily, you may remember those days, we quickly assembled a team and said, oh, maybe we shouldn't have killed the entire IE team. That maybe not have been the best idea ever. So let's build it again and get something out to say, hey, we're back in the game. When IE8 came out, we said, OK, well, we've got the old Quirks mode. That's the default. So a lot of sites still work in that. We've got this IE7 implementation of standards. So IE8, we really want to do standards right. But if we do it right, we'll kill all the old IE7. So let's keep all three. And we'll put one switch, a binary switch, to go between three different settings. IE9. We said, OK, well, we've got Quirks. That's the default. Can't get rid of that one. 7 standards. That's the default in the local intranet zone. Can't get into that one. IE8, that's all my brand new stuff until today when I released IE9. So let's go ahead and keep that one with the new HTML5 one called IE9 mode. Now we got 4 with a binary compatibility switch to go between them. IE10, it gets even more fun because we kept all 4 of those and added a new standards mode for IE10 and a new Quarks mode. Now there's 6 with a binary switch to hide behind. 6 different ways you could render a web page. And if you are not aware of which one you're rendering in, you're kind of leaving it up to the heuristics and leaving it up to chance. Now, we say we'd love for public-facing websites to just go in and update every time to make sure that they work correctly. That's great if you run a public-facing website and have people actively maintaining that site. The average ratio of developers to websites in most companies I work with is 10 websites to 1 developer. Average. And a lot of people have a lot fewer. A lot of organizations just rent out, create me a website, and those people scurry along and they never see them again the rest of their lives. Yet I'm responsible for keeping track of what's going on there. So if I start to actually start tracking what is it that people are using, and I do it intentionally so that when I release software, I say, you know, if you're going to make something new, please use a new rendering mode, right? So in case of IE, the average breakdown that I see for internal web applications, 70% Quarks, 30% 7 standards. That means 7 out of 10 internal software applications, 70%, run a 1999 implementation of standards. The remaining 30% run a 2005 implementation of standards today in 2012. That's not where most people hope they could be. There's a short-term risk for that. Here's an interesting statistic. I had someone come in to me. I was working with a customer over in London, and the developer comes in, and for some reason, I inspire this in people, right? People always want to come in and show me how awesome other people's stuff is. I don't know why that happens, right? If I'm flying on an airplane and I pull out and I'm wearing like a Microsoft shirt, someone says, oh, you know, I really love my iPad. I'm like, why are you telling me this? So he comes in and wants to tell me how awesome Firefox is compared to IE, because that's what I inspire in people, apparently. So he comes in and he shows me, hey, here's Firefox. Look at how fast it is. The JavaScript runs so fast. Here's IE 9, your latest and your fastest. And look, it's so syrupy, molasses-like slow. Why can't you guys write fast JavaScript? So I popped open the F12 tools and said, oh, it looks like you're running in Quarks mode. Since you're running in Firefox, you probably run with the latest standard, so why don't we go ahead and promote you? I did not at that point know how fast Quarks mode was. I mean, is there a difference in performance of rendering engine? So I figured it's worth a try. He's already picking on me. The worst I can do is get picked on again. So I popped it up to 9 standards. Boom, we were faster than Firefox. He was like, whoa. It just happened to have been using Quarks mode, which then got me curious. It's a lot faster. So I used the Sun Spider test, which we didn't make, so no one could accuse me of being, favored. And I actually had to run a slightly older version because it turns out that our Quarks mode doesn't run the latest Sun Spider. And I ran it on all 4 modes. Quarks mode, 7 standards, 8 standards, 9 standards. 8 standards and 9 standards are very similar. 9 standards was the fastest of the 3 browsers that I had on my box. It was faster than Firefox and faster than Chrome. Chrome was faster than the 8 standards mode, but they were neck and neck. And they were all literally, flip a coin. Maybe if I ran and something else wasn't running in the background, something else would have won. Super, super close. Firefox was a little bit behind that. So they were all tightly knitted together. And then the 2 tailing lines, 10 times slower, 7 standards and Quarks. So literally, if you don't take the intention to start building in and opting up to newer rendering modes, the 2 defaults for internal applications will be 10 times slower than what your browser is capable of. So if you don't plan to start evolving that forward and building those fireworks, you got a short-term risk. You're not getting all the perf that you could. Then let's think long-term risk. Quarks mode, a 1999 implementation of standards. IE 5.5, basically. How many kids coming out of college that you might hire into your company do you think developed for IE 5.5? Ever. Probably none. How many coming out of college do you think are running IE today? At all. We're trying to change that by making IE really good again. That's not really an area where we're doing great in terms of market share. It's going to be hard to find people who can maintain that code because they've never spoken that dialect. So I've got a short term, I'm not getting as fast as I want. Long term, I may not be able to hire someone who can maintain that. That's going to be like all my COBOL stuff. And I'm tired of paying those guys so much money. Let's start trying to evolve that. Think now about the team. All right, this is a really powerful effect, the Pygmalion effect, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And I talk about this one a lot because it turns out to be, I think, remarkably important to a lot of teams, that those who set themselves up to feel that they can succeed are much more successful. It's really remarkable. The other thing that's interesting about the Pygmalion effect is, for those of you who have computers out, try doing an image search for Pygmalion and finding something that you can put on a screen without getting into trouble. Turns out that ancient Grecian paintings are not so modest that I can put them on here. But this turns out to be really important, is helping people see the goal and get there. And I speak to this a lot around tools and how we can use tooling to measure and how to set goals and set up a belief in oneself. Because the interesting thing I noticed about tools was that the average use for a tool, what I see more often than anything else, think about the Application Compatibility Toolkit. Think about the Office Migration Planning Manager. Here's what actually happens. Someone says, well, you've got to use it because Microsoft made it, and it kind of seemed like they should know what they're doing, so we're going to run it. So they run it, they get the data, they take a database, they stick the database over in the back corner of the room, and they never look at it again the rest of their lives. And then they just do their migration like they would have anyway. That's the most common use, to check the box saying, I used a tool, so therefore, I'm not on the naughty list. It's one of the most remarkable emotional aspects of tooling that I've ever seen. Right? We had this challenge with Office. Office is one of the biggest sources of this problem. When we look at the data suggests this. The Office Migration Planning Manager, the more I use it, the slower my deployment goes and the longer it takes. The less I use it, the faster I go and the cheaper it is. Yet, if I don't use it at all, people feel emotionally empty. We're nerds. We want to use something automated, some kind of tool. So how do we use tools sensibly? Because I can't just say don't use them, even though the data clearly indicates, yeah, you know what? Using the tool seems like a terrible idea, because everyone who does ends up sad. How do we turn that into something that helps people believe they can actually get it done? Because that motivation is very robust. How do we set a goal? How do we track that goal? When we look at the research on how do we motivate people, people's performance just improves over time because they get better at doing a task. That's natural. If we give them feedback on how they're doing, their performance increase goes up a little bit. Not so much, but a little bit. If we give them goals at the beginning, it goes up a little bit. If we give them both, the performance increase goes up dramatically. How do we set objectives? And this is why I talked about enabling pilots and getting seats out there, because it turns out that one of the most effective ways to motivate a team going forward is to have deployed seats. One of my favorite success stories from any customers around the process they used, they're actually a case study, so I can name them instead of referring to them by all these sort of lugubrious, they're in this industry and in this general vicinity of the world. This was Continental Airlines, back when there was a separate Continental Airlines, did deployment by role. And they started with Gate Agent. And they said, all right, Gate Agent, they run about 10 pieces of software. And they're actually relatively low risk, because if one of them breaks, you know what they can do? Pick up the phone and call the call center the same way that you would, and have them do it for them. Get those 10 pieces of software working, deploy those seats, report to management, hey, here are some seats we got done. They're rolling, they're running Windows. Actually, they went Vista first and then went Windows 7. And one of my favorite stories actually inadvertently deployed the entirety of Newark Airport by accident. And no one noticed until the end of the day. I thought that was pretty funny. They're like, oh, I guess everything does work. But then they went on to the gate reader, the thing that scans your ticket, and there's a couple other things you could do right up at the gate once we're going on, but there's not too much. Deployed those, went on to the call center, and each and every time there's like, here's a dozen here, here's a half dozen here, here's 3 dozen here. Get them done, deploy the seats, motivate people, and have the team moving faster. They've got this wind at their sails, success at their feet, and they keep going faster, faster. Management loves the project. They're not killing it. Way, way better to the litany of canceled Vista deployments. They finished a Vista deployment. They finished a Vista deployment. That's how effective it is. It can get you to deploy Vista. But that concept of how do I use data, how do I drive that, really important. So the final part, and for those of you who are sort of here to get greasy and dirty and nerdy, don't worry. We're still going to do that. I am still Chris Jackson, and I cannot avoid getting nerdy in a session. But this sort of touchy-feely stuff really, sadly, works. I wish all the nerdy stuff was enough, but it's not. This is one of the interesting problems we've got. We have a massive, massive problem with externalization, where people don't figure the cost of what's actually going to take to get something done. They're not paying for everything. Externalization is a concept. Think of it like, what do you do to your house? If I completely redo my house and all of my landscaping and the place is beautiful, there's a positive externalization in that the property values of my neighbors' houses go up. They did nothing to earn that. Great if you're a neighbor. Now my property values went up. If I decide to open a factory farm in my backyard and suddenly I have 13,000 pigs inside of a giant shed, it turns out that property values in other houses, through no fault of their own, start to go down rather a lot. That's an externalized cost. If you aren't paying your neighbors for the lower cost of their house, that means you're able to suck away from other people land value and you don't have to pay for it. That's an externalized cost. Think about it in another context of how externalized costs might go wrong. Let's say I were able to sell you a mortgage and then get a commission for having sold you that mortgage, and then take that mortgage and bundle it up into something else, let's call it hypothetically a CDO or a CDS, and sell that risk off to someone else, and now I've gotten my nice bonus, and I walk on my merry way, assuming that no one's going to default, and then now there's a big market for all of these, let's see, CDOs out there, and let's say people do, it turns out, default on their mortgages. How could that go wrong? How does that happen for software? It happens all the time. Software is a work of engineering like anything else. I can design a house to last a really long time and be maintainable, or I can design a house to not be so maintainable, right? I can build a thatch house designed to last me if I'm a nomad for a little while I'm hunting in this region of the woods. It's thrown together with some straw and some leaves, and I move away, it'll blow down in a couple days. Or I can build the Parthenon. Turns out the Parthenon, slightly more expensive. Same thing is true of software, also a work of engineering. I can design software to be maintainable for 10 years or for 1 year, and usually you can get a fairly good indication of how long they intended it to be maintainable by how long they actually support it. If I design software to just work today, and then they hand that software to you and say, here, keep it going until 2070, but they don't give you a check to cover the cost of maintaining it, they have externalized their costs to you. Is that fair? Everyone's like, yeah, oh no. Does that happen? And this is the challenge. This is the Tom Sawyer. They've convinced you to paint their fence. They've gotten their reward. If they get some piece of software that enables some new business, and they have a fantastic gangbusters year, and they get these massive bonuses. How many of them have come by and said, you know, you guys are going to be on town, but here's a third of my bonus? How often has that happened? Probably not too often. Yet you bear all of the cost. You become like a risk haven. We'll just throw all of our risk here and keep it going. To show some of the insanity that leads to, I actually had to take the demo slide. It turns out we don't have a math slide. So I made my own, and I figured we could do some math. Yes, I'm actually going to do math on the screen. How often has that happened? Welcome to MMS. This is the math edition. So here's where most people start. The cost of failure for any given app, this is how they treat it, is approximately equal to infinity. So risk management means, well, just spend infinite dollars and make sure it works. Here's a much more sensible approach, right? If I take the cost of failure multiplied by the probability of failure, I want to make sure that that's greater than the cost of testing. If it is, test the app. If it's not, don't test it. It's like going to a parking meter. The parking meter costs me $0.25 each time. And every single time I go, I pop a quarter in that guy. If I go to work 1 day a week, and I know that the meter checker person comes by 1 day a week, there's a 1 in 5 chance I'll get caught. If the penalty for not putting my quarter in the meter is $1, morals aside, should I put my quarter in the meter? It costs me an average of $1.25 every 5 times I go to put quarters in the meter. It costs me $1 if I never do. If all I think about is ruthless finance, never put a quarter in that meter. It doesn't make sense. This is the kind of business math that drives sensible decision making. So let's talk about one of the areas it's fascinating to me that have been pawned off to IT, which is we're going to go to a new platform. Business, tell me what you have. Oh, I don't know. You go find out. You're the IT guy. Right? Let's take it in the Office scenario, because we've been talking a lot about Windows but not Office. Right? How do we figure that out? So we take the approximate number of apps. We can go survey them. That's got a cost, right? But let's say we take the approach of we'll survey, and then we'll rationalize, and then we'll look at what's left. Right? That's the approach. Find everything, cross off the stuff you don't want, and then look at what's left. That's what we've all been trained, right? How much does it cost me to rationalize it? Well, if I take all of the apps that I found, I'm going to have to pay someone who makes maybe a moderate rate, hourly rate, to go through and look at things, times whatever time it takes them to look at that, and make sure that that's less than the cost of the rate of my business executives, times the number of execs, times the time they spend, to make sure that it's sensible for me to do that for them. We start putting this math together, and we say, all right, let's say these people are an average of $300 an hour resources, and there are 100 of them, and they're each going to spend a day listing all the stuff that matters to them, to get all of their people to do that, right? And that ends up being a total cost of $240,000 US. For them to provide me with the list. But they didn't do that. They think that's our job. Let's go find everything and cross it off. How much does rationalization alone cost me? Let's assume that discovery is a contained cost. I can find that, although that does vary by organization as to how much it costs. I'm just going to look at a list and cross things off. Let's look at Office. The average number of Office documents in the typical enterprise organization is 25 million. Now, let's say I've got people who are working for a partner, making $100 an hour, and they're going to spend about 5 minutes each looking at that and determining whether or not they think it's important. If I run this math through, I'm like, all right, so that's going to end up costing me $200 million just to rationalize. Boy, that seems like a great idea. And then you think, oh, well, clearly you're paying people too much. $100 an hour for that? No way. So let's go ahead and say, yeah, that rate, that's the problem. You just don't know how to run an efficient IT shop. Let's get some minimum wage people making $7.25 an hour and give them the same 5 minutes. How much does that cost me? Oh, it turns out that cost me $14.5 million. That's still kind of greater than $240,000. So clearly, I'm taking too much time, which is the only variable I have left. I have no control over how many documents there are. So how much time do we have to give our minimum wage people, who we scooped out of the McDonald's employment line, to look at our documents to tell us whether they're business critical? How much time do they get? 4.7 seconds. Does it make sense for us to be accountable for what matters to the business with our McDonald's people? It doesn't. Yet this is the math that we keep doing. Right? And I don't want to do math the whole rest of the time because I think that might be a bit extreme, but I'll just kind of reference one of the other bits of math that's interesting. People love to hear probability and statistics and things sound good. Here's an interesting one. I actually ran this math through. Right? We had someone who was like, oh, we're going to convert all of our Office documents from the old binary formats to the new XML formats because we can save up to 50% of our drive space. And I said, all right, let's look at your documents and the average size, and we ran the math on theirs, because they were saying they were, I think, 13 meg was the average size for their docs. We looked at, there's actually a formula that's been put out there that I copied that looks at the cost because it goes down every single year. Hard drive space costs less every year. So to even things up, I said, let's take Windows Azure storage rates and assume that it goes down at roughly the same rate as has been happening for the past 30 years. Seems a pretty safe assumption. And it turns out that for them, what they would save in hard drive space by converting to all of the latest file formats in Office was $30,000. They were going to spend $400,000 on a project to save $30,000 in drive space. They just hadn't done the math. So stopping to do some math, I think, makes a bit of sense. So can I introduce some things there to kind of get you thinking about, are you being asked to do something completely mental? Because people do it all the time. So I'm going to spend some time sort of diving into some issues and diving into some troubleshooting, not really, in the sense of I'm going to train you how to all be app-compat debuggers, but to kind of give a sense of what's actually being found out there, but to kind of summarize up what the general guidance that I give to folks to be thinking about when it comes to not only getting there today, but future-proofing themselves. The number one recommendation I have is to add metadata indicating what you want, and particularly for IE. And IE is a huge payoff. In some of the initial documentations geared towards public-facing websites, we said, yeah, you really, really oughtn't to use XUA compatible. I am fighting with everything I can to get us to say, unless you're an enterprise, in which case put it on absolutely everything you can so you don't have to touch it again just to go to a new browser. If you're running a public website, that's a different story. If you're running an entire portfolio of stuff that you don't feel like touching, mark them, and most of the time you won't have to touch them again. When we think about how do we manage software, right? We just put out there and said, listen, it's insane for you to expect us to go find it all. At the same time, it's not very fair for the other side to say, if we're not going to manage stuff you haven't told us about if you haven't made it easy for them to tell you about the software they want you to manage, and had a process that onboards things in a sensible way. Right? We see this all the time with organizations that put things in such a prohibitive way that people circumvent it. One of the biggest challenges or opportunities that we have is for custom-made software distribution. right? How many of you guys do System Center stuff for updating software? And how many of you have someone in your organization that wrote some kind of self-updating file to go around your system? Right? Is that because the system is too complicated or too slow? Or did it historically, did it used to be that way? And have we made it easy for people to onboard stuff? If someone tries to say, here's an Access database that I'd like to submit to be managed, do we make it easy to say, oh, all right, so another Access thing. Whew. All right. Let's find a way to have that be friction-free and bring that in and manage it and say, all right, you know what? There's nothing wrong with it being an Access. But that may not be the long-term solution that we want. So let's look at how we help them build that long-term solution in a way where we share the cost and we share that responsibility together. Because the problem is usually both ways. They aren't telling you. They go down to Best Buy and buy it, and suddenly it's theirs, right? Or they fire up Access, and next thing you know, it's running a division, and you're like, wait, what? We have a solution for that already. This is redundant. Make that easier, and this is becoming more and more the challenge. If you don't need to change the defaults, don't change the defaults. I swear there are security guys that believe that they are paid by the number of group policy settings they modify. That's not a good way to pay people. We make them modifiable for a reason, because sometimes there are scenarios that are important that are different from typical scenarios. Other times it's because we just kind of couldn't make up our mind. But either way, if you're changing it, you shouldn't go one by one. A friend of mine, Aaron Margosas, who writes the article Sticking with Well-Known and Proven Solutions that I showed earlier on, did a session for a couple of conferences called Unintended Consequences of Security Lockdowns. Right? Because he works with the federal government that had this program called the Federal Desktop Core Configuration, now called the U.S. Government Configuration Baseline. And they did something that in isolation made sense. We're going to not grant the SE debug privilege to anyone. SE debug lets you get into any other process on the system, even those that an access check would deny you to. They're like, ooh, that sounds like a really dangerous thing. Let's not give that to anyone. It turns out that not giving it to anyone, including local system, means that you cannot install any database software made by anyone ever. Because they all depend on it. They didn't plan on that. It just sounded like a good idea. So let's get a little nerdier here and dig in. I'll kind of see what other, I'll get all the non-nerdy stuff out of the way. Oh, here's the IE6 countdown, by the way. We're starting to look pretty good. The US is finally below 1%. You'll notice we, by the way, are great at cherry-picking numbers. We very seldom put the corporate adoption rates because corporate doesn't look quite so great for us on IE6 because that's where all the IE6 still lives. It's actually really interesting. You can watch. We have hourly statistics. At 9 o'clock, IE6 usually goes bloop, and at 5 o'clock, it's like bloop, every single day. Because no normal person actually uses IE6 on purpose. So let's talk about... let's not do that one first. I'll use this one. I like this one. But let's talk about rendering issues. Not that one. Let's do that one. I'll point out, first of all, I'll jump to this one first because this is the bug that causes more pain than anything we've ever done. So IE6 had at least one bug. Believe it or not. And that bug is, if your doc type is not the very first line of markup in your code, we didn't read it. And if we don't read your doc type, that means you get Quarks mode. And when we fixed that bug in IE7, we started reading it, which means all the web applications in the world that put their doc type a little bit later in the file suddenly got promoted from Quarks mode to standards mode. There's a fairly large difference between Quarks mode and standards mode. Oops, wrong one. I want that one. And that is, in quirks mode, when we measure an element, we measure an element to include its border and padding. In standards mode, right, it wasn't just us, by the way, right? This is about the way that browsers used to do it, right? Netscape did this too. And the standard said that's a really silly way to do it. The width of an element should be the width of the element. And you could argue both ways. I think it actually makes sense the way that both older Netscapes and older IEs did it too. If I think about, say, a door. If I were going to build a door to fit me through, well, I'm a guy with a width and a variable amount of padding depending upon how good the food is where I happen to be. If I were to make a door, I would want the door to fit me plus my padding. Otherwise, I got to kind of squeeze through and it doesn't really fit. So it kind of arguably makes sense, but the standard said, no, this is it, so we changed it to be standards compliant. What happens when you start subtracting all of those pixels into your layout? Things look all kinds of goofy. Like this, where it turns out there are 2 edit controls and a drop-down box, and I can't even see the drop-down box. It's just gone. In an element that has a doc type. It just happens to be in XHTML. What's the first line of markup in XHTML? The XML declaration, which means the second thing is the doc type, which means all of your old stuff running on IE6 and XHTML all got bumped to standards mode by us fixing that bug in IE7. And that turns out to be so systematically problematic. I had one customer where they said, you know, here are all the things that don't work. It's a big pile of stuff. It doesn't work in IE8. Over 80% of it was this bug, and they could fix it by dropping back to quirks. I had one customer in my favorite escalation of all time. 600 apps don't work in a company that had 300,000 seats. 300,000 seats is a big enough organization that you get a really good VP at Microsoft to represent you as your corporate sponsor. Really good VPs at Microsoft are fantastic at getting me on airplanes. Fortunately, this airplane was bound for Bordeaux, France, so I wasn't so sad about that. And we get there, and I talk about this bug, so I talk about it early. In my, I've got a technical session the day of classroom, and then we start getting hands-on, and we're talking about this bug, and they're like, oh, okay, we do all XHTML. So the guy's like, excuse me, and walks out. I don't see him again the rest of the day. I'm like, all right, that dude's gone. Kind of strange. He comes in the next day, and he's like, yeah, so that little doc type thing, yeah, we're all XHTML. And so I just went through and flipped them all to quirks mode, and yeah, there's only one that's still broken. I'm like, all right, so it's Tuesday now, right? So it's about 11 o'clock, because apparently he stayed until like 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm like, all right, so that's great. There's no reason to have any more class. There's one broken app. Where is it? We'll just go there. He's like, well, that team's up in Nantes. I'm like, all right, so they're in Nantes. I'm like, looking at a map. I'm like, I've got a car. It's a 3-hour drive in the spring in the French countryside. I'll just meet you up there. So drove up there and sat down. And that was a really, really nasty JavaScript problem that really boiled down, in essence, to them not giving an element a name and then doing getElementById with the empty string. Kind of strange, right? What does getElementById do if you get more than one element found? It gives you the first element in the collection. First, as ordered by what? Oh, that's not defined. Turns out it's undefined in a different way in IE8 than IE6. The solution? Give it an actual name. And then it will be the only one found, and it will work. Boom, done. It's now Wednesday at 4 o'clock. We're done. The application's working, and we went from 600 broken to 0 broken in 2.5 days. Great. Let's start deploying. So the next day, it's Thursday morning. They're starting to push things out. They walked into me and said, all right, it's about 10 o'clock, and we've started deploying, and so far so good. And while you're here, we have to speak English, and it's really starting to piss us off. Could you please leave? Yes, sir. Not a problem. Had my little phone. They said, SMS me if there's any problem. Drove out to Saint-Emilion, got a bottle of red, got a baguette, had my Kindle. They never called. 2.5 days, 600 to 0 broken, all because of this bug. So it's good to know about this one. And how can you test it? F12 Tools, click it back to IE5 Quirks. Does it work? Ah, you've got that problem too. Quick way to test, handy to know about, and that is by and far the most common bug that we see. The second most common thing that we see, boy, a lot of you are tweeting at me. What is going on? Oh, someone thinks I'm great. Thank you. I didn't even have beer in this one. True story. Last MMS, we somehow conned the event team. It was the last session of the week. It was the Friday session, and we conned them into putting an open bar inside of our room. It was awesome. I asked this time, but they're like, it's Monday, and MMS technically hasn't even started yet, so we don't think we're going to get them liquored up for lunch. So I tried, though. The second most common thing, and we see this across every single platform that we get. And I harp on this, and every time I start going over and over and over this, people's eyes start glazing over like, we can't, no one would do that in real life. No one would do that. The version check. Here's a real statistic. Windows 8. So every day for Windows, we have a daily build. And after the daily build completes, we run automated testing of applications that used to run on the prior version of the OS, in this case, Windows 7, to determine, are they still working? Because if they stop working en masse, we go back and go, oh, that's not cool. What happened? And let's go figure that out. And the failure that we have, the failure rate, we have about 17% of the hundreds of applications we test for Windows 8 were failing because we changed the version number of Windows. And that's it, for no other reason. We changed the version number. And we didn't even change the major version number. It's 6.2 for Windows 8. They're checking for 6.1 and failing if it's not there. That's how common it is. Here's an application. So I mentioned my poor friend with the 16-bit apps from the healthcare. This is another healthcare app. So this is an app, NMH's Northwestern Memorial Hospital. This is an app that a friend of mine uses. So he's the director of functional stereotactic neurosurgery at Northwestern University in Chicago, which is where I live. We have a great deal going on. Every single time I need brain surgery, he handles it. And every single time he needs an app fixed, I handle it. So far, he's gotten the way better end of that deal. And I don't feel so bad about that. But he's in healthcare. And healthcare is one of the most difficult industries because no one player is large enough. We talked about this early on. So here's the problem with his app. His version of the MS script engine is not sufficient. It will not function correctly. How do they know? So, well, I decided to go in and take a peek and see if we can find it. It turns out that the phrase not sufficient is relatively unique, so we can find it. And here's the actual display. Oh, you're not going to find it for me this time. Oops, no, don't do that. Oh, yeah, here, hold on, sorry. Let me go back. One of the things about the F12 tools, if you go through and decide to set a new rendering mode, we'll just go ahead and keep on using that forever until you close your browser. So I was kind of locked into an old mode. Here we go. And if I go into the F12 tools, go over to the script tab, not sufficient, and I keep, oh, really? You're not going to find it for me? All right. This is the fun part of going against someone's still actively being used website is that you notice that people occasionally change things, even between when I was in the speaker room this morning and right now. But that's okay, because I can still go and find it here. So I'll hit refresh. And if I go, I can find, there should be a checks.js. There it is. Let me go ahead and save this down, and I'll show you where this is. And we'll just drop this on the desktop. And we'll go find it in here. And here we go. Here is the version check that they wrote. If the script engine major version is less than 5, or the script engine minor version is less than 5, say it's not sufficient, because they wanted to make sure you had at least 5.5. Right? What version is the script engine starting in IE 9? The new Chakra JavaScript engine. Version 9.0. Is 9 greater than or equal to 5? Yes! Is 0 greater than or equal to 5? No, I wrote my logic wrong. And I would have never caught that before. How would you write this differently? Well, you would have to say if it's less than 5 or script engine major version equals 5 and the minor version is less than 5, or otherwise fault through. It turns out to be hard to write. That, incidentally, is why Windows 7 is version 6.1. The number of Windows XP checks written like that. Is 6 greater than or equal to 5? Yes. Is 1 greater than or equal to 1? Yes. Let's say we called Windows 7 version 7.0. Is 7 greater than or equal to 5? Yeah. Is 0 greater than or equal to 1? No, those XP checks would have failed. This increased our compatibility with XP apps. That's why we did it. Number 1 most common, and it happened again. I was over in Warsaw, Poland, the first time I'd ever been to Poland, and I talked about the version like we would never do that, they never do that, and then we get to the part, okay, class is over, bring me your apps. They bring me an app. What was it doing? If the version of the browser was equal to 5, because they wanted to exclude IE4. This is how old the app was. Otherwise, see if it's Netscape, and otherwise assume that it's IE4. Default was IE4 behavior, and IE5 had a breaking change. That breaking change didn't go away in later versions. It was a version issue in their JavaScript. Happens everywhere. Happens in apps all over the place. The most common error message that I see, other than admin error messages, are, I wish you were Windows XP. 17% of apps. So version numbers happen all the time. And I would love to sort of keep debugging and getting nerdy, because this is the kind of stuff that's really kind of cool. But I have about 2 minutes, so we'll go ahead and close it up and just give you a sense of what to expect. And note that one of them I had to change code for. The other one, switching out the versioning numbers. Actually, let me do one more real quick, because this one is just amazing to me. I don't want to lose this one. Let me close all my IE windows and just show you the power of understanding the platform. This is another live website. I hope they haven't fixed it since I tested it this morning. Mockingbird, the one that says, hey, wow, you're using a browser that sucks. Here's what they're doing. They're going in their HTML and saying, hey, please pretend to be IE7. And then they're trying to be an HTML5 app. And finding that being an HTML5 app isn't working out so well when they asked us to please be IE7. If we were to run it in standards mode, the default, if they'd done nothing, would have been to work. They actually put in a break me switch. How does it all come together? Number 1, recognize. We're dealing with human beings. Embrace their emotions. Find ways to inspire people to get them to want it, to get them to be motivated, figure out how to measure how badly or well things are going as you go along to help you become more agile. To instead of thinking of, let's build a big pile of stuff that will stay around forever, to be built to change and evolve and embrace all of the new stuff that sounds awesome. With that, thank you very much for attending. I hope it was helpful, and have a great rest of MMS.